Members of the ancient Mesopotamian cult of Ishtar have been subjected to various interpretations by scholars despite only a few textual references. In scholarly literature, Assinnu have been described as everything from cultic prostitutes to castrates to playboys and festival people. Today, I will discuss textual attestations of Assinnu in ancient sources that have been deployed for various interpretations relating to gender and sexuality. In the most general terms, an Assinnu is a person that is associated with the temple of Ishtar. Several texts mention Assinnu participation in dancing or mock battle performances, both within the context of religious activity directed toward deity Ishtar. A few texts from Mari also name Assinnu who deliver prophecies. In order to make sense of the variety of interpretations of Assinnu, I systematically looked at the secondary literature and collected terminology used to interpret Assinnu. I identified 5 categorizations that scholars have labeled Assinnu with: male sex assignment at birth, eunuch, prostitute, homosexual, and transvestite. Looking at translations of 2 literary texts which contain mentions of Assinnu, Era and the Descent of Ishtar, we can see a variety of these interpretations. Even early translations of the Era poem, like Harper's 1894 edition, which translates Assinnu as Hiradul, already contained interpretations relating to Assinnu sexuality. Translations of the Descent of Ishtar are a source of more interpretations of Assinnu. Jastro's 1915 edition of the Descent of Ishtar translates Assinnu as eunuch. Notably, E.A. Spizer's translation also maintains the eunuch interpretation. This translation is in Pritchard's text anthology that is still widely in print. I was assigned this book for my Intro to Ancient Near East course as an undergraduate, and the Open Syllabus Project records that the book is present on 354 course syllabi across the country. Just looking at the student population reading the single translation, this is not an insignificant audience. Besides these glosses of the word Assinnu and translations of texts, most recent publications specifically analyzing Assinnu wholly reject interpretations of prostitution and castration. But all publications on the Assinnu share an interpretation that Assinnu are assigned male sex at birth, despite varying interpretations of an ambiguous or non-normative gender performance. Even the CAD definition, which mentions but similarly rejects previous interpretations of castration, uses he as the pronoun for Assinnu, revealing the underlying assumption of a male sex. 2 of the most recent in-depth studies of the Assinnu likewise maintain the argument that Assinnu are assigned male at birth, while also arguing that there is evidence for gender non-normativity. In his 2016 book, Masculinities in Third Gender, Ilan Peled clearly argues that Assinnu are assigned male at birth, but perform a feminine gender in opposition to the normatively masculine Korgaru. According to Peled, a key part of Assinnu normative femininity includes taking the receptive, or to use Peled's word, passive role in sex, an assumption I will talk more about later. Svard and Nissanen take a more careful approach to emphasize Assinnu gender ambiguity, but still occasionally use he/him pronouns for Assinnu. This reveals the underlying sex interpretation, even if ultimately arguing that Assinnu gender is ambiguous. Sure, Assinnu might be a grammatically masculine word, but if arguing, as I will, that the sum of textual attestations indicate an ambiguous gender performance, I contend that gender pronouns for Assinnu should be avoided completely. This paper diverges from these 2 studies and is heavily inspired by the fantastic work of Sophus Hele in his 2018 article, Only in Dress: Methodological Concerns Regarding Non-Binary Gender. I follow Hele and posit that as scholars studying cultural artifacts, we do not have recourse to identify the sex of Assinnu. I use Hele's broader critique of gender methodology and brief discussion of textual attestations of Assinnu as a starting point from which to specifically dissect scholarly interpretations of Assinnu. This project then is mostly historiographical in nature, seeking to bridge the gap between Hele's theoretical analysis and the more purely philological analyses of Assinnu that have been published. I reject all 5 categorizations of Assinnu mentioned previously: male sex assignment at birth, eunuch, prostitute, homosexual, and transvestite. This rejection is based on a lack of specific textual evidence, and also keeping in mind the methodological core established by Hele that biological sex is unknowable from texts. In this presentation, I will spend the most time establishing the evidence in favor of Assinnu gender non-normativity and the lack of evidence that Assinnu were necessarily assigned male at birth. The rejection of the assumption of a male sex assignment of Assinnu then undermines and disrupts the arguments in favor of the remaining categorizations relating to gender transgression and sexuality. Before moving on, I want to quickly clarify how I will distinguish and use the terms gender, sex, and sexuality. I am following a constructivist approach akin to Judith Butler and will be treating gender, sex, and sexuality as distinct analytical categories to fully evaluate the assumptions at play in scholarship. A simple distinction between the three terms is sex refers to how someone is identified based on their body. Gender refers to how someone is identified based on cultural symbols, and sexuality refers to sexual behavior or desire. It is important to note that none of these categories are binary. These categories also have not existed statically across time, but are socially constructed modes of analysis. Even sex is socially constructed as an analytical category distinct from gender. Sex notably is also not binary and can be assigned to a person based on a variety of biological factors from genital anatomy to chromosomes to hormones, with many people not fitting into a normative binary. Complicating matters, in the modern period, these words have also come to be associated with expressed identity. Since we do not have access to first-person texts written by Assinnu about themselves, we cannot talk about how Assinnu formulated their identities, but we can talk about how they are perceived and represented by others in texts. At the end of the day, gender is a social construction with the function of categorizing people, and I'm interested in thinking about how Assinnu fit or don't fit into established categories for people in these Akkadian texts. Finally, it is important to note that when scholars of gender and queer theory discuss gender as performative, they mean that all gender is performance. All people always perform their gender, whether they are aware of it or not. Gender performance is not limited to the intentional or non-normative, but is a constant performance in which normativity is policed and enforced. Now to answer the question, how do we know if Assinnu performed a non-normative gender or sexuality? The clearest piece of textual evidence for non-normative gender is found on tablet 4 of the Era epic. In this literary text, Ishtar is explicitly described as changing the gender of the Assinnu from Zikrutu to Munis, or masculine to feminine. This mutability is certainly exceeding a stable binary distinction between genders. Additionally, this text is likely a source of the assumption that Assinnu were assigned male at birth. It involves the described directional vector of Ishtar's changing of Assinnu from masculine to feminine. But first, the extrapolated interpretation of male sex relies on a literal reading of a literary text. This text might not fully represent the lived experiences of real Assinnu. Second, Era might include the masculine to feminine passage to emphasize the mutability of Assinnu gender rather than limit Assinnu to one particular gender manifestation. The association of Assinnu with knives and sharp objects in this text is used as indirect evidence for castration. In the notes to this translation, Foster offers that self-mutilation was perhaps part of the ritual activities of the cult of Ishtar. However, neither Foster nor the text itself explain exactly what the asaku, or abominable acts, are. It could indeed be self-harm of some type, but it is not necessarily castration. Or asaku could refer to something that is taboo outside of a particular context. It seems that many scholars connect the Assinnu's apparent non-normative gender, or as many scholars have argued, femininity, to some kind of genital alteration or focus on a very literal interpretation of the Era text where Ishtar turns masculinity to femininity. I think this goes back to the very deeply ingrained equation of gender and sex. This is directly related to modern medicalization of trans bodies wherein surgical intervention or medical diagnosis is required, just to name one example, to change gender markers on state-issued identification. In order to perform a gender that does not conform to the sex assigned at birth, surgery or genital alteration is not necessary. Despite this, many continue to believe that genitals are somehow inextricably linked to gender performance. The logographic writing of Assinnu is further evidence that Assinnu cannot be easily placed into binary categories. In lexical lists, the syllabic writing Assinnu is equated with a couple of different logographic writings, sag or sag and munis. Munis, sometimes also written with the determinative lutu, is particularly interesting. The component parts of this logogram are lutu, a Sumerian word for person used in Akkadian as a determinative for jobs, or a Sumerian word for man, and munis, a Sumerian word for woman. This combination of words relating to gender indicates that Assinnu do not fit neatly into either category, either or munis, and their gender is more complicated than simply normatively masculine or feminine. The determinative lutu in the logographic writing of Assinnu, lutu or munis, might also inadvertently prime scholars for an interpretation of Assinnu being assigned male at birth. Lutu is equated in dictionaries with Akkadian awilu or amelu, often translated as man or a more general human. But when used as a determinative, lutu is not exclusively male and not necessarily masculine, but denotes a job. For example, modern English male man is masculine, but the job is certainly not limited only to males, even if the masculine word is used to describe the profession as a group. Professions sometimes have a munus determinative indicating that they're considered feminine, or sometimes job designations have no determinative. Sometimes Assinnu is written syllabically as or munus or sag with no determinative, so lutu cannot be used to argue that Assinnu were definitively or only assigned male at birth. But one could argue that Assinnu fit into a category with other people possessing a job with a lutu determinative, since they all share the same determinative. Most importantly, perhaps the logogram lutu or munus does not hide a true underlying sex assigned at birth, but just represents the liminal gender of the Assinnu as not being completely man or woman, but parts of both are somewhere in between, with the simultaneous use of both gendered words. Or perhaps or means dog and not man, and there is no gender incompatibility with the logographic writing. Another interesting text, Indagan A, might indicate that Assinnu wear clothing that is considered both masculine and feminine. If the Assinnu are the subject of the entirety of the third and fourth Kurugu, they are perhaps described as wearing masculine clothing on their right side and feminine clothing on their left. Additionally, here in lines 55 and 57 are mentions of weapons. This is especially interesting as weapons are present in birth omens and used as a symbol representing masculinity. Alongside weapons for a boy or nita are spindles for a girl or munus. In another text, Assinnu have spindles. So in Indagan A, Assinnu have weapons, but here they have spindles, indicating that Assinnu can have objects associated with masculinity and femininity. Even though I don't think this text is about Assinnu, I bring up this omen because it has been used as an argument for Assinnu homosexuality. I agree with the most recent editions of the text shown here on the top, which do not include the word Assinnu because of the line break in one copy across where the word Assinnu has been read. Also, no other attestations of syllabic writings of Assinnu use the as3 sign, which has been proposed as a reading instead of Z. Peled notably interprets this text as indicating that Assinnu cannot become erect and therefore must take their receptive role in sex. Peled notes the difficulties of this text with line break, as mentioned previously, but still postulates that Assinnu could be homosexual. I think even the mention of a possibility of a homosexual interpretation is a problem, as again, we do not have recourse to the sex of Assinnu. With this omen not about Assinnu, only one omen remains that does mention Assinnu sexuality. This omen, while it does indicate that sex with an Assinnu is considered a positive thing, says nothing about Assinnu sexuality in particular. Peled, as well as Svard and Nissinen, argue that since the following parallel omens refer to Nowilu having sex with people commonly interpreted to be male, the Assinnu must be male too. But the parallel omens before this Assinnu omen are about people marked munus. So the organization of the omens in a list says nothing about the sex assignment of the individuals involved. And if it is not certain that Assinnu were assigned male at birth, this certainly cannot be called homosexuality. The only other text used to interpret Assinnu sexuality is a set of parallel curses in the Descent of Ishtar in the Epic of Gilgamesh, wherein an Assinnu named Atsu Namir and a Harimtu named Shamhat are cursed with the same language. Shamhat is commonly interpreted to be a prostitute, which is already a questionable assumption. The existence of this parallel does perhaps indicate that the two figures are considered similar in some way, but it in no way necessitates that Assinnu are prostitutes. So, if Assinnu aren't necessarily male or castrated or prostitutes or transvestites or homosexual, what can we say about them? I would categorize Assinnu gender as ambiguous, non-normative, liminal, and non-binary, but I would be cautious to categorize it any further than this. Here I am using non-binary, not in the same way as modern people do as an identity label, but purely as a description to indicate that Assinnu do not fit into a masculine, feminine, or Zikru, Sinishtu binary. In this paper, I just focus on the gender, sex, and sexuality issues related to Assinnu, but there is certainly more to say about Assinnu participation in cultic activities and prophecy. I also want to think more about how ambiguous gender is potentially part of these religious roles. Finally, I want to emphasize that I want to move on from attempting to categorize Assinnu based on modern identity-based terms like homosexual or transvestite. I don't think it's productive to imagine a time-traveling Assinnu and observing what bathroom that they decide to use, for example. Instead, I want to embrace the ambiguity of the textual attestations of Assinnu and move forward from there to more carefully explore how gender was actually socially constructed in the ancient world. Gender, after all, is just a means of categorizing people. I want to examine how these ancient Mesopotamian categories function and where lines were drawn to establish normativity, how normativity was enforced, and to explore how non-normativity functioned alongside normative categories. Thank you.